Hello and welcome to our presentation on queer conundrums across the generations and how to become restored through restoring. My name is Gypsy Hosking.
And I'm Manja Visschedijk.
Like everyone, we are each a complex mix of experiences of marginalisation and privilege. In this presentation, we are going to share a few snapshots about the complexities and conundrums of our experiences as a mother and daughter, living, loving and working across the intersections of illness, age, culture and sexuality.
Taking a light-hearted look at the particularities and peculiarities of the conundrums in our own lives, we hope to shed some light on the serious problems that can bedevil the lives of many when dominant and degrading narratives gain a stranglehold. We hope to also point to some possibilities for loosening the grip of some of the harsher stories told about us by using some of the ideas and practices associated with narrative therapy and community work, thus becoming restored through restoring.
This talk is adapted from a keynote speech that we were honoured to deliver at the 9th National LGBTI Health Alliance Conference in August 2015. Now, LGBTI stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex. We encourage you to check out the Alliance website for information and great resources about the LGBTI community. Today, we are speaking to you from the Dulwich Centre in Adelaide, Australia, and we would like to pay our respects to the Kaurna elders, the traditional custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and to acknowledge that Australia's Indigenous peoples have never ceded sovereignty of this land. As we draw strongly on intersectionality in our talk, we also honour and acknowledge the efforts and activisms of the women of colour who first developed these ideas, such as the 1970s Combahee River Collective from Boston, and Aileen Morton Robinson, a Goanpool woman from Queensland, who gave us the book Talking Up to the White Woman. Intersectional theory and practice shows us that all oppressions are connected, and that addressing racism, white privilege, and the ongoing intergenerational impacts of colonisation in Australia and around the world needs to be central to our politics and our practices as educators, activists, counsellors and community workers.
From an early age, I lived in the intersections of culture, class and heteronormativity. My family and I emigrated from the Netherlands to Australia in 1956 when I was barely 2. We were officially called New Australians at that time, although there were a lot of other more derogatory labels applied to us as well, and some lighter labels like cheeseheads and clogwogs or just plain wogs. And perhaps this is where my fascination with language began, as I learned how names and words were used to sort people into different categories and to assign these categories with different levels of worth. Even as a child, I could see that dividing and naming practices exerted a powerful influence over determining who had access to the best land, houses, jobs, education, health, status, safety, and well-being. As a child, I could see that the less valuable piles had a lot of wogs in them, and I could see the unfairness, the injustice, and the wrongness of that. At the same time, I was also aware that my parents and the immigrant communities that I belonged to were determined to make some change. What I was less able to see as a child was that the piles people were sorted into were not two-dimensional, but multiple and complex, overlapping and interlocking. It was much more complicated than the us against them wars that we carried out as children roaming the streets of our neighbourhood. As a child, for example, I couldn't see that as a Northern European New Australian, there were certain privileges accorded to me that weren't available to the darker-skinned migrants. I rarely saw the Meru and Nurrunjeri owners of the land I lived on because they'd already been driven out to the mission far outside the town boundaries. I absolutely could not see how I benefited from the marginalisation and exclusion that came with white colonisation. And I could not see how those privileges protected me from knowing that my community, my family and myself were implicated in the injustices enacted against Aboriginal people. And if Aboriginal people were only visible in my peripheral vision as a child, then intersex, trans and gay, lesbian and bisexual people were utterly invisible. I didn't even hear the word homosexual until I was about 18, when I was working at the local fruit factory, along with my mother and her friends, women whom I loved and trusted deeply, and I believed them when they warned me to stay away from those itinerant women who act like men. They were dangerous, unnatural and sexually perverted. And yet, within 10 years of that moment, I was living, loving and raising children in a lesbian family. What is interesting to me is discovering how those wonderful women elders of mine came to be used as vehicles for heteronormativity, and in doing so, learn about some of the sneaky ways dominant discourse might trick me into serving its agenda as well. And what is even more interesting to me, however, is discovering how that powerful heteronormative discourse came to be named, defied, and subverted to the extent that I'm able to stand here today, together with my beloved daughter, with our lives a testament to the strength, beauty, and diversity of same-sex families.
So my older brother and I, born in 1983 and 87 respectively, were some of the first children to be born via donor insemination to lesbian parents in Australia. So before this time, LGBTI adults did have children, but the idea of deliberately starting a co-parented queer family was a new possibility brought on by changing social and political times. Manja did not give birth to me, but she is one of my mothers. My brother, Manja's biological son, is not biologically related to me, but nevertheless, he is my brother. Because Australian culture and law is heteronormative, that's where heterosexuality is the presumed default, the natural or the normal way of being. We have been fighting our whole life to have our relationships seen and accepted. The list of invalidating moments is long, and it includes the first time that we went to the snow and the ski lift operator refused to sell us a family ticket because, as he said, a family means a mother and a father and 2 children. It was my first day of school, every Mother's Day, parent-teacher nights, and questions over who could sign my permission slips. There was the 10 years where I pursued my dream to be an elite athlete, and I decided, because of the culture of homophobia in sport, that it would be easier to present as a child of a single mother. Through hundreds of little comments or microaggressions from both mainstream and same-sex communities about real mothers and real families, to questions being asked about whether my brother and I had the same right to sit with the family at our grandparents' funeral and to be listed on the order of service as a grandchild. So intersectionality helps us expose inclusions and exclusions, and the ways in which certain concerns come to be named as universal concerns and priorities for our society, while others are silenced or marginalised. Take, for example, the mother-daughter relationship. There are particular norms about this relationship that are shaped by heteronormative discourse, which defines who gets access to services within the health system and who is excluded. When I was just a baby, I suffered a life-threatening condition, which saw me rushed on a hectic 4-hour ambulance drive from the south coast of New South Wales to Canberra Hospital for emergency surgery. So my mum Annie went with me in the ambulance, and Manja stayed behind to organise care for my brother and our various furred and feathered family members. As my biological mum, Annie had unquestioned entry to the hospital and was given a room so that she could stay with me, based on the assumed truth of a baby needing her mother to increase her chances of survival.
With the love, help and support of our extended chosen family, I headed for Canberra the morning after Gypsy had been rushed off in the ambulance. I knew that I would be labelled as a non-relative in the eyes of the medical institutions, and as such I would have none of a mother's rights, and in fact would be strictly excluded from the intensive care ward. The accepted truth that underpinned this health policy was that non-relative visitors posed an unnecessary health and infection risk for the baby. And I clearly remember running over and over these obstacles in my mind like a rat in a maze with no way out, all through that long, agonising bus trip from Bega to Canberra. What on earth was I going to do? I was uncomfortable in hospitals at the best of times, so the prospect of walking in and simply getting lost or being exposed as an interloper and being thrown out was really very, very daunting. And I'd also heard stories of children who'd been removed from their biological mothers for being in lesbian households. And I was deeply worried about our family coming under the close scrutiny of medical authorities. But I also knew I had no chance, no choice but to try. And I couldn't leave my co-mother alone to deal with all those scary medical interventions. After all, in the eyes of our family, I was Gypsy's mother, and I had a clear responsibility to be there. And while Gypsy was not the child of my body, she was utterly and absolutely the child of my heart. And there was a clear possibility that she could die during the surgery. By a lucky chance, my spiralling thoughts latched onto something one of our nurse friends had said. A hospital is a big, unwieldy bureaucracy. The staff are constantly shifting on and off roster. No one's ever quite sure who is family and who is not. If you act like you have a right to be there, they might think someone else authorised your entry. So perhaps, if I embraced my own preferred story about our family to the exclusion of all others, and wrapped myself tightly enough in the knowledge that my family needed me, that I was a strong, brave woman, and that I would not let them down, then I might just find a way through. Now, the story of that hospital encounter has many chapters, but suffice to say, I found my way in. It took nearly a week for the hospital authorities to discover that Gypsy had two mothers staying in the hospital, and that one mother or the other was beside her for every moment of every day. We never left her alone. Our precious daughter survived, and the bonds forged in those acts of shared love and devotion proved a powerful affirmation of our family in general, and of our relationship as heart mother and daughter in particular. And it became a powerful foundation on which to stand during the many battles for recognition of our relationship that were still to come. Hospitals and the 1980s health policy based on heteronormative ideas might have been huge, powerful giants, and a queer heart mother's love, but a small, insignificant sparrow in comparison. But a sparrow can always hide behind a giant's back and dart out to fly much faster than a giant can walk.
Let us now look at a snapshot of my life story some 28 years later. So for me to have an open, honest and authentic conversation about myself and my life, there are three things which I need to come out about. Three things which defy the default assumptions about normal people and normal families. Firstly, I'm a lesbian. Secondly, I have lesbian parents. And thirdly, I have an invisible, incurable chronic illness. So my sexuality gets lost in stories of my illness, and my illness gets lost in stories of my sexuality. My family is always getting lost in both. When people don't already know at least one of these three things about me, then even the most basic conversation becomes complicated. And I have to decide whether this is a situation where I wish to disclose, and if so, how much do I want to tell? In that moment, I have to toss up whether disclosure is safe. What are the potential consequences of disclosure? Do I have the time and the energy to deal with the further questions that may come? Or do I fall back on the standard accepted answers even though this is not my truth? So firstly, I'm a lesbian. I was lucky because I grew up with lots of women who span the spectrum of sexualities. So I had a language and a positive framework through which to understand my attraction to women. I had no internalized homophobia to overcome. I had no fear that my family would disown me or kick me out. I firmly refuted the idea that homosexuality was a sin, and I already knew a supportive queer community. But in some ways, I was almost naive because despite the exclusions I had experienced because of my family, it never occurred to me that I would lose friends by coming out. But I did. And shaken by the negative reactions of my peers in high school, I started researching more about homophobia, and I was presented with this world of discrimination, violence, and hate crimes. I realised that while my family's experiences wasn't easy, there are LGBTI people across Australia and around the world experiencing far worse than us every day. Now, I'm trying to find my place as a young queer woman with an invisible chronic illness. And I'm troubled by the silence or the lack of overlap between chronic illness or disability and our queer community. In all my research about my illness and how to live well with it, I never see diverse sexualities or gender mentioned or acknowledged. Furthermore, despite the many efforts of queer people with disabilities, disability remains on the fringes of LGBTI politics. I hope that as counsellors and community workers, you will find ways to challenge ableism and to include all bodies in all of your conversations. So secondly, I have lesbian parents. So one of the most complicated things for me coming out was negotiating the stereotype that queer parents raise queer kids. It's a common argument that gay and lesbian parenting is not in the best interests of the child. This thinly veiled heterosexist argument goes so far as to claim that LGBTI parenting is harmful, as they will raise sexually deviant and gender confused kids. So then here I was with my sexual deviance and my subversion of the traditional gender roles. So I was caught in this impossible bind where honesty about myself could be used as ammunition against my parents and queer parents in general. I'll share with you one memorable example. So when I was at university, I had a problem with my ovaries, and the doctor that I was seeing recommended that I go on the contraceptive pill to treat the effects and to balance the hormones. So after going away to think about it, I came back and said, yeah, look, I've decided I will try the pill to treat my polycystic ovaries. Oh, and while I'm here, I also need a repeat script for my antidepressants. Now, these are antidepressants previously prescribed by a different doctor, but at the same medical clinic. Now, one of the first things that new doctors do is check family medical history and living circumstances. So she looks over my file, sees that I was born via donor insemination to 2 lesbian mums, and muses.
You've had a fairly unusual upbringing, haven't you? Do you think that this has contributed to your depression?
Well, at this time, I was still dealing with the aftermath of an unexpectedly rocky coming out. So I replied honestly saying that, yeah, sexuality is part of that. And she seized on my comment.
So you think you are homosexual?
Yeah.
And how long have you felt that way?
I don't know, late high school maybe.
Oh, that's a bit late. Most people have felt that way all their lives.
Well, I just wasn't attracted to anyone before that.
Have you had any therapy on this issue?
Assuming she meant the issue of my rocky coming out and the issue of homophobia in a heteronormative society, I said, yeah, I've talked to some counsellors. However, the issue of homophobia had not entered her consciousness. What she wanted to know was,
have you worked on these issues specifically? Have you seen a psychiatrist and said upfront, I need to examine the family pressures which have influenced my sexuality. You know you need to be assertive and find someone who's good in this area.
Cue my baffled silence. What issues? What is this doctor even talking about? But my silence meant nothing to her. She simply forged on from her position of heteronormative power.
You see, my dear, you have had quite unique pressures on you. It's quite possible that unconsciously you identify as homosexual to show your parents you hold no prejudice against them and that you approve of their lifestyle choice. You are saying, see, I don't care that you're gay because I'm gay too, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. All children want to please their parents. I just think you should go and talk with a psychiatrist so that you can discover your true sexual identity, not the one you have been putting on. You need to examine the pressures that have made you feel this is the only option. You don't want to be limited to the corner you've backed yourself into, do you? There's a whole range of sexualities, you know.
I'm sorry to say that this conversation was not exaggerated, as I was so stunned by her reaction that I wrote down a word-for-word transcript as soon as I left the clinic so that I could ask myself, did that really just happen? The scary thing is that this doctor was so thoroughly steeped in heteronormative judgments that she honestly believed she was acting in my best interests. And she was so utterly blind to her own power and privilege that she was unable to hear anything I said, nor accord any measure of worth to my own expert opinion on my history and my identity. So the third thing that I need to come out about is that I have an invisible chronic illness. So 10 years ago, I got sick, and then I just never got better. Eventually, I was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis, commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome, an incurable and debilitating neurological illness characterized by problems with the nervous, immune, and endocrine systems, resulting in extreme fatigue, body pain, cognitive dysfunction, neurosensory problems, and many more unpleasant symptoms. Now, it's really important for me to acknowledge that my suffering during this illness has been minimalised by my privilege. If I didn't have financial and physical support from my family, support which is enabled by their privilege, or I didn't have the money to keep seeing doctors and allied health professionals, or the English language skills to negotiate the welfare forms, then I would likely not have the resources to be able to sit here speaking to you now. So the longer the illness went on and the sicker I got, the more parts of my life and my identity became lost to me. I lost my claim to identify as an athlete, a student, an activist, a worker. As I was isolated and often housebound, my social identity as a woman, a lesbian, a friend, a relative, felt increasingly irrelevant beyond the feeling that I was doing a really poor job at all of them. Soon, I was left with only the reality and the identity of the chronically ill, otherwise known as the failed healthy person. So, over the last few years, I've worked really hard to embrace my illness and to integrate it into a positive identity and life story. I still have times when I grieve for the loss of the person that I was and for the imagined future that that person was going to have. But this is my life now, and I'm okay with that. I've adjusted my lifestyle to accommodate and to respect the chronic fatigue syndrome. My illness affects all parts of my life, so I decided that it was time for me to start talking about it. But to my surprise, I found people were very uncomfortable about me identifying as a person with a chronic illness and being open about my experience. People continually feel the need to deny my experience by giving me a pep talk, or sharing a possible new cure, or a new diet, or tell me the story about a friend who had the exact same thing that I've got, but they're fully recovered now. Oh, you'll be right. This is such a dominant cultural response that a feminist blogger named Anahan created a bingo game out of all the unwelcome things that the health privileged say to people living with invisible chronic illness. So when I was trying to be open, honest, and authentic about my life, I was positioned as a pessimist who was just not trying hard enough to get better. You have to stay positive, I'm told. They could find a cure, I'm told. And the classic, oh, but you look so good, you don't look sick at all. And I'm not just talking dominant culture silencing here either. For example, when campaigns from within the queer community argue for marriage equality by holding up the image of the highly well-adjusted, heterosexual and healthy children who are statistically proven to be just like children raised in heterosexual families, I get to feel like I failed again. The image portrayed of the typical same-sex family is often that of the able-bodied, white, middle-class, nuclear family. In this way, equal marriage campaigns can unwittingly contribute to the silencing and the invisibilising of children and young people from queer families who live with physical or mental illness, or who live in the intersections of many other marginalised communities.
As we said at the start of this presentation, we are each of us a complex mix of privilege and oppression. All of us inadvertently enact exclusion from our positions of privilege. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh described it as a knapsack of unearned assets and opportunities carried blindly on our backs, so much a part of us that we forget that it's there. And this privileged blindness leaves us at risk of making erroneous assumptions and judgments. Now, my training as a narrative practitioner has given me some strategies for minimising this risk of causing unintended harm, which I would now briefly like to share. For example, when I sit down in a therapeutic or a community setting, I try to remember that every conversation shapes identity, and every conversation reproduces or subverts normative judgment. Often by positioning people on a continuum of success or failure. Every conversation circulates ideas about what constitutes pathology and what does not, and every conversation can enact individualising and blaming practices, or it can situate problems in a social and political context and privilege a relational telling of identity instead. Knowing that I will always be positioned in places of privilege and power when I am performing my profession, I ask myself, how can I offset the ever-present hazards of being used as a vehicle for social control when my intention is always to work towards social justice? Well, firstly, I can hold myself directly accountable to the marginalised persons and communities that I work with. Dominant culture requires me to be accountable to professional codes of conduct, agency policies, performance indicators, but none of these require direct accountability to the people and the communities that we're supposed to be helping. Direct accountability means building genuine relationships with people from a diverse range of communities and just routinely checking in with them. It means ensuring that the concerns and interests of those communities are brought from the margins to the centre by taking what Michael White called a decentered but influential position in therapy and community work. Secondly, I can hold myself accountable to my peers. I can make sure that I'm in close contact with colleagues who will engage in robust, critical, reflexive conversations with me about our practice. And thirdly, I can try to visualise the three-dimensional, intersectional web of power I'm stepping into upon entering each new therapeutic conversation. I can try to see who else is positioned in this intersectional web and where they sit, who is immediately visible and who is in the shadows, whose voice is being heard and whose is being silenced or ignored. And I can listen for expressions of failure or self-condemnation, because these are likely to point to instances of oppression or discrimination. I can use inquiry rather than offering expert diagnosis, externalise rather than locate problems within people or communities, use experience near language that closely matches that of the community I am accountable to, and listen for the hopes, values, purposes, commitments and intentions of that community, because these expressions will provide openings into news of difference, leading to the rich description of alternative storylines, preferred identity conclusions and new possibilities for exercising agency.
So let us explore that now in the everyday telling of my life stories. So remember, as I told my stories, I couldn't easily talk about my sexuality, dating, relationships, my family, my home life, my work, or lack thereof, or my thesis on children with lesbian and gay parents. I was fast running out of options. The failure story lurked down every avenue, and the invitation to silence, to avoid disclosure and awkward conversations, was immense. But then, during one of the hardest patches of my illness, my mum Annie gave me a bunny rabbit to brighten my increasingly gloomy days. And from there, my passion for bunnies took off, and my growing skills and knowledge in rearing them and breeding the most beautiful babies became an opening into a new preferred territory of identity. I had found a conversation lifeline. By chance, I had found an activity, an alternative storyline, and an associated preferred identity that everybody likes: bunnies! Yay. And yes, these are all my bunnies. Instead of being trapped in the failed sick person story, I was delighted to restory as the crazy bunny lady of McGill, and in doing so, I was restored to a sense of worth and well-being. Cultivating this eccentric bunny lover identity was a playful and fun way to step outside the story of failure and to position myself in what narrative therapy calls a preferred story. And now I can avoid the awkward questions of "how are you?" or "are you better yet?" because the first thing people ask me now is, "how are your bunnies?"
I would like to finish now with one brief final snapshot. As well as being the mother to Gypsy, I am a daughter myself, and the relationship I have with my mother shines a light on a whole different set of intersections across age, illness, culture, and sexuality. At this point in time in dominant Australian culture, elderly people are often storied as being a burden or a drain on resources. And those of us who choose to care for our loved elders are often storied as martyrs, worthy but boring, colourless people sacrificing our own needs. The idea of the live-in carer having an active polyamorous sexuality seems a contradiction in terms, in much the same way that the idea of a lesbian mother was considered an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms back in the early 1980s. So in 1982, my mother and I were sitting in a cafe in a small country town in South Australia. I had taken the unusual step of inviting my mother out for a coffee, and her typical Dutch response had been to say, "Why go out and pay when we have good coffee and better cake at home?" But I had insisted because I wanted to be sure that no other family member would overhear the news that I was pregnant, courtesy of an anonymous donor and an inseminating syringe, and that she was going to become a grandmother in a lesbian family. My mother's voice, never quiet at the best of times, had boomed out incredulously, "You did what? With what? But that's impossible." So at that snapshot moment in 1982, heteronormativity, speaking through my mother, had deemed the lesbian mother an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, an absurd impossibility. Everyone knew lesbian sex could not produce babies. And religious dominance deemed homosexuality an abomination and a sin. And small town Australian culture deemed same-sex relationships to be sick and disgusting, and the idea of raising a child in that environment seemed utterly abhorrent. Yet over the next 30 years, thanks to the efforts of our queer communities and the love and support of people like my mother, these stories of abomination and sin and impossibility were challenged and totally transformed. And it's my hope that in the next 30 years, stories of caring for the sick, the elderly, the asylum seeker, and the differently abled will all be transformed too. My mother passed away 3 months ago, having peacefully lived out the last 2 years of her life in the home that I made for her, with the love and support of all of our friends and family. And the story I have to tell of those 2 years is not one of burden, but of reciprocity, beauty and joy in partaking of the mysteries of living and of dying. In refusing the neoliberal judgment that measures the worth of our lives in economic terms, I found immeasurable riches. Throughout our lives, my mother and I each gave to the other according to our abilities at the time, and we received according to our needs. And I salute my beautiful mother and her living legacies.
So, in conclusion, we need our political judgments in order to take action. But we can become much more skilled in noticing the boundaries, the inclusions and the exclusions as we create them. We can become much more skilled in noticing who we exclude. And we can become much better at owning where we sit in this complex three-dimensional web of power and privilege, and continually revising our priorities in light of that. We can take heart from this irrefutable truth of our 28-year-old heart mother and daughter relationship as we stand here before you.
Our relationship proves you don't need blood ties to be family.
And if anyone can be family, then everyone can be family.
Therefore, if we are all family, then your struggle is my struggle.
And until all of us are free, none of us are free. Thank you.
Thank you.